this is what I wanted to show you. My first musical instrument, it's a 5-string banjo. It's got 4 long strings and this one short string here. It was made in the 1920s, so it's about 100 years old. And when I bought it, I was still at school. I was about 15, I think, and I bought it from an old man in Southampton. It cost me £5, which seemed like a lot of money at the time. The thing is, the banjos had quite a lot of bad press over the centuries. I don't know why. I mean, just because it sounds dreadful. Well, if it's in the wrong hands, obviously. But it's not like a guitar, is it? I mean, with a guitar, even if all you do is just repeatedly bash it with a frying pan, half of the audience still end up swooning into paroxysms of romantic whatnot and throwing their underwear onto the stage and things. I mean, banjo players don't tend to have that particular inconvenience. But don't knock the banjo. According to archaeologists, banjos were being played in ancient China hundreds of years before Christ. And then came the ancient Arab traders, and they were ferrying stuff backwards and forwards across the Indian Ocean between China and India and Africa. And their ships got infested with, well, not only with rats, but also with banjos. So they were pioneers in a way, which shouldn't really be any surprise because, after all, the ancient Chinese and the ancient Arabs were doing higher mathematics and astrophysics and predicting quantum theory at a time when Europeans were still setting each other on fire for daring to suggest that the Earth wasn't the shape of a pizza. Anyway, when the banjo reached East Africa, it quickly spread across the whole continent and then later across the Atlantic Ocean with the slave trade. Oh, and back across the Atlantic Ocean the other way to Ireland, where they still play it now, like the amazing Eddie Whelan's doing here in this clip. It wasn't quite full circle. After all, the Irish didn't manage to sell it back to the Chinese. Anyway, back in America, the stuck-up cultural elites at the time really began to hammer the reputation of the banjo as a kind of a primitive abomination that was played by slaves and brown people, you know. And to add insult to injury, they put on these minstrel shows. But despite all that, the 4-string tenor banjo, which is a bit shorter than this one, became so popular in the 1920s that you'd get ordinary people walking around in the street accosting strangers and saying, "Oh, excuse me, would you mind awfully giving me the G?" It was this popularity that led to the banjo bands and the early swing bands of the 1920s and 1930s. A lot of them had banjos. And then it kind of disappeared from view for a decade or two until the early 1960s, when this guy called Earl Scruggs developed a 3-finger picking technique for the banjo, for the 5-string banjo, for bluegrass. And it launched this whole fleet of dudes with Stetson hats and high-heeled boots in Nashville, Tennessee, doing this. And they were singing, "I played around and stayed around this old town too long," and all that. But it doesn't actually need to be like that. If you've ever listened to Sunset Road by Bela Fleck, he's a giant of a musician who completely rethought the banjo, reconceived it. He actually made it sound exquisite. But even if you haven't reached the heights of Bela Fleck, it's not too much of a stretch to try out some unusual things, like, for instance, this jazz ballad by Thelonius Monk. It's called Round Midnight, and it goes something like this. It was just an idea.